King Richard III of England has gone down in history not just as the last English king to die in battle at Bosworth Field, but for the infamous alleged act of having his nephews killed. His nephew, Prince Edward, was of course going to be crowned king, but instead, he and his brother, Richard, Duke of York, ended up in the Tower of London as virtual prisoners, and they never left, long presumed to have been murdered by their uncle, Richard III, or at least on his orders. But is Richard actually guilty, or has he been wrongly accused? Now, first, we need a bit of background on Richard. He was actually part of the medieval aristocracy during the famous Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars in the mid 1400s between the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions, and Richard's brother Edward held the Yorkist claim to the throne. And when he finally defeated the Lancastrian forces, he became King Edward IV. So Richard, as the brother of the reigning king, became Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And we should say here that Richard was known to have fought very bravely for his brother and was also very loyal to him. In fact, Richard was actually a knight. He was a Knight of the Garter, a very prestigious honor that few people are given. And yet, he's known to be, in history, a very terrible guy. So, where did this bad impression come from? Well, that bad impression might have come from something called Tudor Propaganda, meaning that after Henry Tudor took the throne as Henry VII, his historians and courtiers would have every reason to make Richard into the consummate villain. And politicians and statesmen like Thomas More did exactly that, writing histories of Richard that weren't very flattering. And Shakespeare basically builds on the same history for his play Richard III. Of course, this forms the basis for the great film starring Laurence Olivier, but is also the reason that Richard is still thought of as a villain today. Now, in April of 1483, Richard's brother, King Edward IV, dies, and his oldest son, also named Edward, is supposed to succeed him to the throne. But there's a problem. Young Prince Edward is only 12 years old, so someone will have to help run things until Edward is old enough to, and that someone is Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who becomes the Lord Protector. So in late April, Prince Edward travels to London, but he and his party are stopped at Stony Stratford. Richard takes Edward with him, dismissing his entourage, who, although Richard gave assurances, were subsequently executed. Is this the start of a plot, or is Richard just looking out for his nephew? Things start to move quickly by June of 1483. Remember, it's just a couple of months since his brother, King Edward IV, has passed away, and already Richard is writing letters asking people to support him against his late brother's widow, the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family, who he suspects of plotting his murder. Richard is paranoid, and in fact, he might have good reason to be. These are treacherous times. Then, shockingly, at a meeting of his council, he accuses Lord Hastings of conspiracy against him, has him dragged out of the chamber, and literally has his head chopped off. No trial, no papers, just killed on orders. It's a gangster move. Soon after, the Bishop of Bath and Wells tells Richard that his late brother's children may be illegitimate, and so they can't be made king. The obvious choice, then, to sit on the throne of England is, of course, Richard. Again, this happens very quickly. Now, while all of this was going on, The Queen and her other son, Richard, Duke of York, were living under sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, but she agrees to hand her young son over to the Archbishop so he can join his brother Edward, supposedly as they wait for Edward to be crowned king, and they'll be waiting in the Tower of London. Hence, the two brothers got the name, the Princes in the Tower. But in late June, their uncle accepts a petition to assume the throne, and he does. And on July 6th, he is crowned as King Richard III. Around this time, a plot to liberate the princes and break them out of the tower is discovered. Is this the catalyst for what comes next? Because apparently the princes were taken into the quote, inner apartments of the Tower of London, where they were seen less and less. And by autumn, they are never seen again. But before we can decide whether Richard may or may not be guilty of what happened to the princes in the tower, we have to look at other possible suspects. The first is Richard's close ally, the Duke of Buckingham, who had helped Richard to gain the throne in the first place, and presumably might have been willing to help him keep it. But could he have even gotten to the princes without Richard's permission? I'm not sure, but he is the only person, other than Richard, that is actually named in a contemporary document stating that he did away with the princes. And of course, Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, who Richard was fighting against at Bosworth Field, would also have reason to want the princes gone, since they could challenge his own claim to the throne. Now, first I thought we should look at the case for Richard possibly being innocent of the charge that he had his nephews killed in the tower. And the first point is that Richard is a knight. He's a real medieval knight with a sword and armor, fighting alongside his brother. In other words, knights are thought of to be noble and honorable people. Also, there was heavy Tudor propaganda that came in the years after Richard died, including the play Richard III by Shakespeare, and that has almost certainly colored how Richard has been viewed by us today, perhaps a bit unfairly. Also, there are a couple of other people that might have wanted the princes dead, including the Duke of Buckingham and the future Henry VII. And in a time when people often died young from disease, it is possible the princes died of natural causes. Hundreds of years later, it's just hard to say. Now, let's take a look at the case for Richard being guilty. Well, of course, the fact that Richard would gain a huge benefit by being king is one obvious fact. But there's also some self-preservation that could have played into Richard wanting to get the princes out of the way and take the throne, because the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family absolutely wanted to take power and precedence at court. And had they been successful, they might well have taken Richard's land and perhaps his life. But Richard struck first. Maybe out of self-preservation, maybe out of self-interest. But it does give Richard motive. He certainly looks guilty. So perhaps there is some kernel of truth in that Tudor propaganda. So, to sum up, can we say if Richard III is guilty or innocent for what happened to the princes in the tower? Well, Richard certainly had some motive. And his rise to the throne did happen quite fast, almost too fast. But if this case were being tried in a court of law today, where a guilty verdict has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, then I have to say, I think Richard would be found not guilty, because there is some doubt as to what actually happened. But I'll say this: if you depose a king and take his place, As the new king, there is only one thing you do with the old king: you make him disappear. Now, most of you who are coming back to my channel know that I mostly do film analysis of Stanley Kubrick films. But since I'm also interested in history mysteries and strange theories, I decided to do something a little different this week. But I promise I'll get back to my Kubrick videos next week. Actually, Stanley Kubrick was also interested in history. As it's known, he had been working on a Napoleon film before he did Barry Lyndon. And if you know any interesting theories about Napoleon, you can definitely leave that in my comment section. But for now, I'll just say, my name is Shim. Thank you for spending time with me, and have a great day.